Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on-demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data. So sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. Well, it's that time of year. Time to start getting ready for tax filing season, or just to keep your vendor data accurate at all times. Get 20 tips to do both. Keep listening. Welcome to episode 306, Cleaning Your Vendor Master File and Keeping It Clean. 20 tips in 20 minutes. Now, this is a webinar that I did, and I'm going to put a link to the actual recording where you can watch the webinar because it's a video recording, or you can, or you can download the handout. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes. But whether you listen here or listen there, this is great information because it is great timing for you to start cleaning your vendor master file. So you can see, especially for IRS 10 matching and tax reporting, so you can find out now whose legal name and tax ID did not match or does not match, because maybe when you onboarded them, it matched, but maybe they merged, maybe they were acquired. Or maybe you're some of the ones that I still run into that don't do 10 matching at vendor setup. Either way, it's a great time to do the bulk upload for 10 matching, find out whose legal name tax ID does not match, and reach out to those vendors to collect a new W-9 before you start getting into the busy period of year end. All right, so enjoy the webinar, and I hope you get some great tips. I'm going to have 20 of them. All right, so we are right at the top of the hour, and we'll just go ahead and get started because there's a lot of information to give in 30 minutes. So my name is Debra R. Richardson, and welcome to this month's 20 Tips in 20 Minutes. And this month, the topic is cleaning your vendor master file and keeping it clean. And it is sponsored by Financial Operations Networks. Now, this is a great time of year to talk about this because you got to get ready for 1099 reporting, but it's also important to make sure you keep your vendor master file clean. And so we'll talk about that. Now, really quickly, some housekeeping items. This session is being recorded tomorrow or before tomorrow this time. Actually, I think it'll be at the time that the webinar is scheduled to end 24 hours after that. You will receive a link to the recording, and keep in mind that will be a different link, but you'll be able to log on to the recording and then also download the handouts. And you can also share it with colleagues as well that you think may be interested in the information. Now, you can submit your questions anytime. Go ahead and throw it in the question/chat area, we'll save it for the Q&A session. And then if you think of questions afterwards, you can always send them to info@debrarrichardson.com. We'll get it to the correct person and reply within 24 hours. Now, there are 2 handouts that you can download. One is a PDF of this presentation, and then I also have a PDF of a service to help you clean your vendor master file. Now, just a real quick bio on me. I am, again, Debra R. Richardson. I was an AP senior manager over a team of 17. We had processed 2,000 vendor requests per month, and we maintained 140,000 active vendors across 7 different ERPs, which means we had 7 vendor master files to keep clean, just saying. But now I work with accounts payable and procurement teams like yours to help you clean your data, clean up your vendor processes, so that you can pay the right vendor. Now, the agenda today, first we're going to talk about the risk of bad vendor data, and then we're going to jump into the lightning flash round of 20 tips, cleaning your vendor master file and keeping it clean. And hopefully I will have up to 5 minutes for questions, but I will tell you if there are more questions, I will stay on as long as you have questions, and you can stay on to answer those for you. All right, but first, I do have a poll question, and it's the only poll question of the webinar. So let me go ahead and launch that. All right, so now you should be able to see it. So go ahead and answer, does your organization currently have a way to automatically detect duplicate vendors? Go ahead and answer yes, no, or if you're not sure, go ahead and select unsure. So go ahead and populate or give your response. And we all know, and we'll talk about it too, right? Duplicate vendors can really, they're not good. They can be, and not only can they be an indicator of fraud, but they can also result in duplicate payments. And so having a way to identify duplicate vendors can be critical. All right, so we've got quite a few that have voted. I'll keep it up for just a few seconds. So if you have not voted, go ahead and vote now. All right, so it looks like we've got 74% that have voted. I'm going to go ahead and close it, and then let's take a look at their responses. And so 61% of you said no. And then 33% said yes, and 6% are unsure. Now, if you said no, which was the majority of you, don't feel bad. Lots of folks don't have a way to automatically detect duplicate vendors, but we'll talk about how you can do that, or why you need to do it, even if you're doing it manually, and then how financial operations networks can help. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and hide that, and let's get back to the presentation. So risk of bad vendor data, and I may be preaching to the choir in this, but let's talk about why it's bad to have vendor data, like what it can cause. So the first thing you know is IRS compliance fines. That's why at this time of year you go ahead and make sure you do that bulk upload, because having the bad vendor legal name and tax ID combinations can result in IRS fines. Not only that, but when you file them, eventually you're going to get those on a CP 2100, CP 2100A notice, and now you got to do the B notice manual process of reaching out to the vendor to collect the W-9, and that's all strictly manual work. The next thing is sanctions list and exclusion list, those fines for paying prohibited vendors. So not only do you need to check your vendors when you onboard them to make sure that they're not on any of the watch lists, but you also need to check on a regular, consistent basis, because those lists are not static. You need to make sure they haven't been added to a watch list since you onboarded them. And speaking of fines, for example, OFAC fines that may be assessed if you pay vendors that are on any of the sanctions list that that OFAC has, then you could be assessed both, or your company could be assessed both criminal and civil penalties. And so if we're all worried about the IRS, yes, we need to worry about them too, but even bigger penalties in the millions can come from paying vendors on these sanctions lists. So you need to keep up with that as well. And then yet another organization that can assess fines is NACHA, and NACHA is the governing body over the ACH network in the US. And so if you send bad banking details in a payment file, those banking details are pulled from the vendor record. And so let's say you haven't updated a routing number from a bank that was involved in a merger or acquisition, you send it in the pay file. Sometimes the banks will change it so that you can have a successful payment, but they're not going to do that forever. And eventually, if you do not change it, when you receive those notices, the notice of changes, if you don't update that banking information, then the bank will report you for a NACHA violation, and that can result in fines. And then let's say, you've got banking information and both the routing number and the bank account number is wrong, right? That's going to result in failed or returned payments, and that's going to cause rework. And it doesn't have to fail because it's a fraud, right? It could be a fat finger. So that can result in rework, which costs you more time. And then that's the same with bad addresses, right? For those check payment vendors, or especially this time of year, come January, right? For those reportable vendors, and you're mailing out the 1099s, right? You don't want to mail out checks. You don't want to mail out 1099s just to turn around and get it back, because all of that is going to cause rework. And then lastly, if you have too many active vendors in your vendor master file, like if you do not inactivate on a regular basis, that's really not good. You could have duplicate vendors that you haven't identified, which I talked about before, can result in duplicate payments or be an indication of fraud. Also, the more active vendors you have in your vendor master file, the more vendors that are now available, open and available for both internal and external fraud. Now, all of these pain points can be resolved by using the vendor info platform by Financial Operations Network, either as the full, vendor self-registration portal, or as a standalone tool where you can perform all of your validations in one place. So more to come on that. Okay, so now we're going to get into the 20 tips, keeping your vendor master file, cleaning your vendor master file and keeping it clean. And I will tell you, I'm going to go fast. So let's go. All right, so we're going to start with the vendor cleanup strategy. That's the first 5 tips. And the first tip is something that I did. Make sure you assign a team member plus a backup per accounting system or ERP. So think back to those 7 ERPs that I had, right? Have one team member as the primary and then cross-train another team member as backup. So there's no reason why that cleanup is not done on the schedule that you identify it needs to be done on. The next one is make sure you determine the number of months or threshold of inactivity that you're going to use to determine when a vendor is considered inactive. So this could be 15, 18, 24 months, or whatever works for your company. I had one client that was like 16 months. I really don't know where I got that from, but they had 16 months. And that really helps to establish, right, what that activity threshold is. And when I managed at 140,000 active vendors, we actually started off at 18 months and then we reduced it down to 15 months because the less threshold of activity, right, you remove the risk of internal and external fraud, or reduce the risk of internal external fraud for those vendors that you inactivated. And then the next thing is I talked about having assigning a team member and then having a backup is really important to make sure you document the process to clean the master file, document your vendor master file cleanup process, include the links to where you go to do the validations, include processes like how you do the bulk upload for the IRS 10 match, wherever you do that at, either irs.gov, maybe you're doing it at 10check.com. Document how that is done. And then if for some reason right now you do not have it documented, as you're going through and preparing for the 1099 season, for example, if you're doing the 10 match bulk upload, just take screenshots and then to include in your soon-to-be desktop procedures. Also document how you pull the reports or the queries from the system. Sometimes that can be a bit of a task to identify, but once you do, make sure you document that. And then also I recommend that you track metrics, at least to the number of active vendors and the number of inactivated vendors when you inactivate them. And you can use this as a way to benchmark your own trends. So I often get the question of, well, how many vendors should I have for my company? Well, there is no better way than to benchmark for your company and then review any anomalies. So if the number of inactivated vendors were significantly lower than in the past, go back and look at your inactivation process to verify it's working correctly. And maybe your active vendors are increasing or significantly increasing. This could mean that you need to perform the inactivation more often, say from annually to quarterly, because now you have more vendors to maintain. And then I also recommend that you add this process, the fact that you're going to do this on a regular basis, to your vendor policy. And so if you are saying what vendor policy, then you really should have a separate vendor policy that is separate from your AP policy, separate from your procurement policy, that really tells the internal team members how to do business with your team, and then have leadership sign off on it. Include the fact that you're going to inactivate vendors and what the process is to reactivate them, and then share that with your internal team members, like on your internal intranet page, because it never fails. Right after you inactivate vendors, it's always that one internal team member that was like, I was just going to use them. But you know what? They're inactivated. Now you have to follow the process to use them, to reactivate them, to use them again. All right, so let's look at some tips for the accounting system or ERP. So if you are lucky, you have an automated process in your system to look at activity and inactivate those vendors instead of it being a manual process. But make sure that you understand what it reviews for inactivity. So make sure that if you are using, are checking purchasing activity, invoice activity, payment activity, and vendor record activity, which are the 4 pieces of activity I recommend that you check to determine the inactivity status. Make sure that you know that it's looking at all of those, or if it's not looking at all those pieces of activity, identify if you're okay with what it does look at to determine the inactivity status. Just make sure you understand that piece. Also, if you are doing it manually with those 7 ERPs I talked about, only 2 had an automated process. The rest were manual, and so we had to identify what reports to pull, and not only that, but make sure that we were including the correct information on those reports. Sometimes we had to create new reports to include all of the activity and the vendor information that we needed. The next thing is, in the accounting system or ERP, hopefully you're doing this for vendor setups and changes anyway, but make sure you comment on the vendor record when you inactivate vendors. Include the date that they were inactivated, the initials of the person performing the inactivation, And so it's actually not practical, though, to do this per vendor record one by one, because typically it's a mass amount of vendors that you're inactivating. And so what we used to do, and maybe you can do this too, is we would create a report that will have the vendor IDs and the comments, and then we would send that to IT or our system team, and then they will upload it in the background. All right, now let's talk about steps to clean your vendor master file. So I always recommend first to inactivate your vendors because it leaves less vendors to perform the validations that are coming next, right? After all, you don't need to have those vendors validated because in order to reactivate them, you're going to ask the vendor to supply, right, to send you the supporting documentation that you require for new vendors. And so you're going to do the validations just like you would a new vendor. And so you're going to revalidate that information at that time. And so I recommend that you first inactivate your vendors and then start with the rest of the validations. The first one being the IRS 10 match. We all know the legal name tax ID combination must match. And if it doesn't, if they're reportable, we could be susceptible to fines and the B notice process. But also you want to make sure that the vendors are real. No fraudulent vendors have crept up into your vendor master file. And then sometimes, right, the vendors will tell us, tell our company, right, when things have changed, not all the time. But then they send it to someone else and it doesn't get to the AP team. So make sure you're doing the IRS 10 match. Also, validate the address format and status. Again, sending out checks, sending out those 1099s. You want to make sure that they are mailable and it's not going to come back to you. And there are resources out there where you can check the status too. You can check whether or not the address is vacant, inactive, or if it's a PO box only address, which could indicate fraud and doesn't have to be fraud, just means that you have to go back and collect the physical address. So make sure you're validating your address format and status. And then also validate vendor banking information. So this includes bank branch information since banks merge and are acquired or fail. We had 2 of those this year, right? And when this happens, right, especially with the bank merges and acquisitions, the routing numbers can change. And as discussed, is one of the risks. You don't want to send those bad routing numbers to the bank because that will cause that can result in a NACHA violation. And then if you have the ability to check bank account ownership, perform that check as well to avoid an unsuccessful ACH or wire payment if the vendor did not notify you of a change, or if a fraudster was successful in getting someone on your team to change banking to fraudulent banking, you can find that out at that time too. Now, each of these validations are possible with financial operations networks using their vendor info, vendor self-registration portal, or their standalone tool that can not only be used for the routing number validations, but can also be used for bank account ownership and the IRS 10 match and sanctions list. So you kind of get them all in one. All right, so keeping with the steps to the vendor, clean your vendor master file. And speaking of sanctions lists, right, now is the time you need to recheck to make sure the vendor has not been added to a sanctions list or exclusion list since you last onboarded them or checked them last. And keep in mind, those lists are not static. They change all the time. With the Russian invasion on Ukraine, the OFAC list increased, and maybe the same thing has happened now with this new news that we've seen about the war effort that's in the current events now. And then it's not just about the IRS tax ID, right? Other countries have vendor registration numbers such as VAT and GST, and you can take this time to recheck those. And then this next one, really the last validation step, is what I call everything else. So many of you have other regulatory or third parties that you use to collect information on vendors, such as D&B. You might collect credit or hierarchy information, or maybe diversity, or maybe you collect insurance certificates. So this will be the time or the place where you put all that extra stuff or additional validations you need to do for your existing vendors in this step. And then finally, the last step, it is the last step in the process, but it is absolutely going to take the longest, because this is where you need to, once you get all your validations done with the active vendors that remained after you inactivated your vendors as the first step. Anyway, you go through, you do your vendor validations. Now you got to review everything, right? So you want to review them and then follow up with the vendors that didn't pass validations. To collect updated information. You might even have to follow up with your leadership or your risk management team if some of your vendors or any of your vendors came up on any of the sanctions on the watch or watch list. This is also a great time to check for duplicate vendors as well. And then keeping it clean. So the last tips is on keeping that vendor data clean. And so what I recommend is, we talked about cleaning your vendor master file and steps in a process to do that. I recommend that you create a schedule and you really make it more than annually, because if you wait to annually, it will result in less more active vendors until you get to the point where you're looking at it once a year. And if you do it sooner than that, then those vendors are inactivated more quickly. And also, you don't have the big overwhelm with doing everything once a year. So I actually recommend that you do it monthly. We did when I had those 7 ERPs, but if you can't do it monthly, then do it quarterly. If you can't do it quarterly, do it semi-annually, and at the very least, do it annually. Also, enforce least privilege access, which means you only give add, edit, or even view access to only those that need it. And that way you won't have other team members changing your information. And just a real quick example, as a practitioner, I did not realize that our procurement team had access to one page of the vendor master file, and that was the contact page. And nowadays that page is critical because that's what you use for like confirmation calls. And so when I did realize that, we got rid of that piece of it. But the less people that have access to your vendor sensitive information, your vendor data, the less you have to worry about it being changed, or for that matter, having another team member be social engineered and have access to give up your vendor's information. And that could be used, right, for fraudulent purposes by the cyber criminals. Next one, kind of talked about this one, but formally its own tip is to treat inactive vendors as new vendors. And so you can reactivate the same vendor record, just require all the same supporting documentation that you require for a new vendor, do all the same validations that you require for a new vendor, and then reactivate that vendor if everything is fine. That way, now you have an existing vendor, you have all their history, and you validated that their information is still accurate. Or you have updated information for them if anything changed. All right, and then the last one, you might be shaking your head at this one, but I recommend, and we used to do this too, is to publish inactive vendors to the intranet for the internal team members, right? Because one, they never understand why we do what we do anyway, let alone this inactivation process. But publish the inactive vendor list on your intranet so they know which vendors have been inactivated. Don't include sensitive information. You can include the vendor ID, the name, maybe the last 4 digits of the tax ID so they can make sure they're looking at the right vendor ID. And then they can identify whether or not their vendor has been inactivated. Don't know if anybody would look at it, but we used to always have it available so they can say, you can answer the question when somebody asks, well, what vendors have been inactivated? All right, so those were 20 tips in 20 minutes. But if you still have manual, onboarding process for your vendors and you're doing manual validations, that can really make cleaning your vendor master file and keeping it clean harder than if you automated it. And automation is where Financial Operations Networks comes in. So here is more information on Financial Operations Network. So if you're interested in getting more information on the vendor self-registration portal to automate vendor onboarding, or get more information on their standalone tool that you can use to perform all your validations at once, including bank account ownership validation, then you can click on either one to get more information or contact them by phone or by using that email address. And also you'll see over here, if you can't see that, it is clickable. You can get more insight on cleaning your vendor master file. Just click the link and go to that blog post. All right, and then for me, here's some information on how to connect with me if you like to do it afterwards. I don't know if I talked about the podcast, but I do have a podcast. I also have a vendor master file tip of the week that I do on my YouTube channel. So if you're interested in either of those or just connecting with me, please do. And so we've got about 3 minutes for questions. And I do want to remind you that if you have questions afterwards, you can email info@debrarrichardson.com and I'll get that question to the applicable person to answer. But if you have any questions, go ahead and throw them in the question section. And if there are a lot of questions and you can stay on, I will stay on to handle those. All right, so I do not see any additional questions coming in. I do want to thank everyone for attending today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks for coming on, and we'll see you next month. So I hope you got some tips from that, and don't forget to check the show notes if you would like to watch the on-demand webinar or download the handouts. So thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 306th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.